Okay, hello, welcome to another lecture. This one's about the 1950s. Okay, let's get started. So, a lot of historians refer to the 1950s, particularly 1953 to 1960, as the Golden Age. That's because there was an extreme amount of economic growth in the U.S. So, for example, GDP, that's the measurement that economists use to say how wealthy a country is, doubled for the United States in the 1950s. There was low unemployment, wages doubled for those who were employed. The United States was the predominant industrial power, which means steel, cars, and you also had a lot of people sort of moving away from manufacturing jobs into more clerical, quote-unquote, white-collar jobs, so like education, finance, entertainment, information, things like that. You also had the rise in different inventions to, I guess we would say, make life easier and more fun, I don't know. So you have the widespread invention, use, accessibility to the television, automatic dishwashers, less expensive phone calls around the country, and less expensive air travel. This led to lots and lots and lots of spending in the 1950s. People were feeling good, so they were spending all their money. Not all of it, but, whatever. Okay. 1950s, you also see the rise in what we now know as the suburbs. Probably some of you live in the suburbs. So, you have the doubling of houses being built outside of urban and city areas, which are the suburbs. And this was sort of encouraged, one, by any builders in the suburbs, but two, you had a lot of low-interest loans, either guaranteed by the government or from banks, especially being given to veterans coming home from World War II. This led to the growth of a lot of states out west, such as California, Colorado, Denver, and New Mexico. And this is because the growth in houses and the growth in various inventions to make it a bit easier to live out west led to that. So suburbs growth in a nutshell. High spending, more money, people want to build things because there's more money. You have the government also and banks trying to give people low interest mortgages or loans so that they can buy a house out in the suburbs. 1950s is again a rise in consumer culture. Originally we have the 1920s, that's a rise in consumer culture, and then the 1950s it just sort of explodes, kind of setting the tone for what the United States consumer culture is nowadays. So, for example, a lot of the ads that you see are trying to say like, oh, drink a Coca-Cola, you'll never believe how awesome it is. And keep in mind the Cold War is going on during this time. So the government and businesses, because they're not fans of communism, wanted to set this tone that freedom means you can buy what you want. So we are considered free because we have so many options of so many things that we want to buy. This sort of advertisement led to a couple of things. So first, a lot of Americans were more willing to be in debt. So for example, to buy your nice, cool 53 Dodge, you probably had to take some sort of loan or pay with a credit card, I don't know, something like that, right? And before the 1950s, being in debt was a no-no, like that would be a bad thing. Nowadays, a lot of people use credit cards, take out loans, no problem, right? And so this is a sort of shift in the 1950s where buying more was good, even if it meant you were in debt. You also have the rise in advertisements. In particular, you have TV advertisements. So television starting to become a common thing in middle-class family households. So as they're watching some popular shows that promote family, like Leave It to Beaver or whatever, they're seeing various advertisements also encouraging them, hey, your family, go out and buy this, go out and buy that. So you have a change in what advertising looks like, which still affects the U.S. today. Okay, you also have a sort of continuation, I guess I would say, in women's roles. So remember, during the war, a lot of women had to go and take on industrial or clerical jobs because men were fighting overseas. And quite frankly, the U.S. needed that labor power. 1945, at the end of war, a lot of those women lost their industrial jobs and their clerical jobs. Some women would continue to work part-time at home, but there was a sort of reversion back to this idea that women have to be in the home again. So they have responsibilities at home, freedom starts at home, they should enjoy their washer dryers, whatever. So you see a lot of advertisements of wives being portrayed at home, and they just love their dang washer dryers, their stoves, apparently a refrigerator, stove, and sink all together, whatever. This is what was being appealed. Mass consumerism to people is that women should stay at home and do these things. You also have this era known as the baby boomer era. So after the war, there's an insane amount increase of U.S. population. And that's because of a couple of things. When you have more women at home, right, they're choosing to have more kids, or maybe not choosing, they are having more kids because that's kind of what's expected of them. You also see some advertisements where family or like woman being at home means freedom. So women don't have to work, they have freedom at home, and it was considered some sort of weapon against the Cold War. Not sure because I wasn't living back then, but I'm sure if you ask some woman, I don't know if freedom means being at the home. Okay, as always, nothing is perfect or beautiful in U.S. history. And so while there's extreme economic growth in some areas, and we have houses moving and women working at home and whatever, TVs and living rooms, there's also parts of U.S. history that is just not working for everyone. And so I'm calling this slide the segregated landscape. So I'm going to start with the suburbs. There was a survey taken in the 1990s in suburban areas. So 1990s, about 40 years after the 50s. And you had about 1% of non-whites living in suburban areas. 1%. 1%. So, a lot of people of color weren't allowed to move to suburban areas. There's a couple of legal reasons why this is the case. And by that I mean it is the government choosing to do things to make this the case. First thing, the government, for any sort of housing where the government helped with the mortgages or helped giving loans, the government had a law that said there could be no resale of those houses later on to non-whites. Okay, so that happens. The government also made it okay for banks to deny loans to non-whites, and the government would deny government-backed mortgages and interest to any person of color. So essentially the government is saying, whites, let's move to the suburbs. People of color, you're going to stay in the cities. And this sort of led to a rundown of cities. You had people living in these buildings that people didn't want to invest in because they're not going to get money in it from banks or from the government. That is a decision, a choice made by the U.S. government to make this happen. And so you have an extreme division in society, and this is happening everywhere, not in the South, everywhere. So about 7 million whites left the suburbs. Those people also had more access and opportunities, especially white veterans, to different jobs that would pay them more money, and education. Meanwhile, people of color, particularly Black Americans, were restricted to manual and unskilled labor jobs. And the U.S. economy starts to change, where manual or manufacturing labor starts to not be as essential because the U.S. economy is changing. And we see that today, right? The U.S. economy is not as much about manufacturing. It's about getting jobs in entertainment, information, telecommunications, things like that. So starting in the 1950s, I mean, we know this happened way before the 1950s, but particularly in the 1950s, there is intentionality behind shutting out certain groups of people based on race and on color from obtaining the same opportunities in society. So bringing that back, because if we're talking about the Cold War and the U.S.'s freedom and U.S.'s place of choice, right, that is clearly 100% not true, right? So, anywho, hope you liked the lecture. Sorry I went on my little Cold War spiel. See y'all later.